Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Towards the end of part 2 of her work, The Ethics of Ambiguity, Simone de Beauvoir is going to talk about two interrelated things that can be set in formulas, you might say. Willing oneself free, which is really central to existentialist ethics. It's not just using your freedom. It's not just willing, but willing yourself free. And also that there be being. Now, you might say, well, you don't have to will that there be being, because there's already being there and you rise up within it. And yes, that's true to a certain extent. And she will actually say, it's not necessary for the subject to seek to be. The subject already is, but it must desire that there be being. So a world for it, something more than just itself, as we're going to see. And she begins by saying, freedom must project itself towards its own reality. So that's an important thing already. In order to be free, you don't just make use of your freedom. Part of what you're willing, whenever you're willing as a free being, unless you're doing so in some sort of weird, perverse way, is your own freedom, that it continue. And we do this in concrete ways, not just in some sort of formal, abstract manner. So it does so through a content, right? Something that it's oriented towards, whose value it establishes. Now, she doesn't give an example here, but in trying to think about what I want to convey to my students a week from today as I'm putting together lecture notes or something like that, I'm making a use of my freedom. And I'm thinking about what I want to do. There's a content. And I'm thinking about the value that I ascribe to it. Is it something I care about? Is it something I'm just doing because I'm getting paid to do it? Do I see some actual good value in other people being able to understand the matters that I'm bringing forward to them? Do I think of them as fellow human beings who might do something different than I do with that very content? And, those are different ways of assigning value to that content. So she goes on and she says, an end is valid by a return to the freedom which established it and which willed itself through this end, a purpose, a goal, right? But this will implies that freedom is neither to be engulfed or absorbed in any goal. The totality of one's freedom is not totally subordinated to that goal. Neither is it to dissipate itself vainly without aiming at a goal. It's existing in something in between those two. So then she says, to will oneself free and to will that there be being are one and the same choice. The choice that a human being makes of themselves as a presence in the world. We can neither say that the free person wants freedom in order to desire being, nor that they want the disclosure of being by freedom. Why? Because these are two aspects of a single reality, the reality of what it is to be a human being. And whichever be the one under consideration. Now notice this is taking us a little bit further. They both imply the bond of each human being with all others. So it's not just, I'm the existentialist and I've got this freedom and I exist in a world where other people are just kind of bit characters, NPCs, as people like to say, figments of my imagination. No, that's not the case at all. She does talk about a problematic that emerges, not just with young people, but I would say it besets older people as well. She says, a young person wills themselves free. He wills that there be being. This spontaneous liberality or generosity, which casts him ardently in the world, can ally itself to what is commonly called egoism or selfishness, focus on just the self. Often, the young person perceives only that aspect of their relationship to others, whereby others appear as enemies, enemy subjectivities, as competitors, right? And not just competitors for the kind of things that we want, like, say, wealth or social status or opportunities, right? The affection of others. But competitors about the very meaning of existence, because they are also free human beings. And so there's a tendency that she brings up, Hegel and Georges Bataille. There's a tendency among some people towards wanting to dominate others, to be the ones who call the shots. And in some ways, the more immature people are, that's the way that they're going to perceive everybody else. Everything turns into, as we call it, a zero-sum game. If I win, you must lose, and vice versa. That, by the way, is how Jean-Paul Sartre tends to depict relations between human beings in Being and Nothingness, which the Ethics of Ambiguity is supposed to go beyond and provide a genuine ethics for. So she says, and at every moment, others are stealing the whole world away from me, as sort of an emblem of this. So the first movement is to hate them. But this hatred is naive, and she says, desire immediately struggles against itself. If I were really everything, there would be nothing besides me. The world would be empty. I would myself be nothing. So if he's reasonable, the young man immediately understands by taking the world away from me, others also give it to me, since a thing is given to me only by the movement which snatches it from me. To will that there be being is also willing other human beings by and for whom the world is endowed with human significations. Like she says, one can reveal the world only on a basis revealed by other people. No project can be defined except by its interference with other projects. So let's dwell on that for a moment. So projects are the way, it's a sort of existentialist shorthand for what we do with our freedom, where we aim at some sort of content or object, we assign it value, we try to see it through, right? So having projects and wanting to realize them requires not just coordination with other people's projects, or that, they help out from time to time. We understand the significance, the meaning, the value of our projects in part by how they are interfered with or interfere with other people's projects, right? So this is actually quite an important point here that we might easily pass over. So she goes on and says, to make being be is to communicate with others by means of being in this world of projects, of commitments, right? And then she talks about even the tyrant. And she references, her early play in which this occurs. Even the tyrant needs the freedom of others. They've got a kind of weird, contradictory attitude. They want to subordinate everybody to themselves, and yet if they do, they don't actually get what they want, because what they want is the free recognition of others. Like she says, only the freedom of others keeps each one of us from hardening in the absurdity of facticity. And she brings up even Christianity. God had so much respect for human beings that he created them free, right? Which is, She ascribes this to an anti-fascist priest, could just as well be St. Augustine or so many other writers as well. So what does this get us? This is how she's bringing this section to a close. She tells us that there are two big charges that get made against existentialism, particularly in terms of ethics, that adopting this point of view helps us see the falsity of. One of them is that existentialists are really solipsists, meaning that they think that they are the only being that really matters and nobody else is really a subject. She invokes Nietzsche's bare will to power. According to this interpretation, as widespread as erroneous, the individual knowing himself, choosing himself as creator of his own values, would seek to impose them on others. Now, are there some people who call themselves existentialists who are like that? Sure. Yeah, you can find immature existentialists, and they're not always youthful immature people. They could be older immature people, and they make recourse, they talk about Nietzsche or Sartre or de Beauvoir, Camus, whoever, right? And they're talking about, I'm creating values, and then they do try to impose them on others. There are people like that, but she says that actually isn't the genuine existentialist point of view. Existentialist ethics condemns them and doesn't so in name of an abstract law, but because if it is true that every project emanates from subjectivity, it's also true that this subjective movement establishes itself by a surpassing of one's subjectivity. You can find a justification of your existence only in the existence of other people who are not you, who are different than you, who don't make the same use of their freedom, or one that you're always necessarily cool with, right? So she says something really interesting here. Moral anxiety, angst, anguish, does not come to the human being from without. He finds within himself the anxious question, what's the use? What's the point? What's the value? And he himself is this urgent interrogation. You can flee it only by fleeing yourself. And as soon as you exist, you answer that, right? What we find, she says, is that I concern others and they concern me. There we have an irreducible truth. You can try to deny it. You can try to go against it if you want to. But there it is. And this leads her to say the me-others relationship is as indissoluble as the subject-object relationship, right? So that's a huge declaration there, and that is a very nice answer to that charge. What's the other charge? You existentialists, you have a formal doctrine. You can't really give it any content and tell a person how they ought to live. As a matter of fact, whenever you ask an existentialist, how should I live? They're like, well, you got to figure that out on your own, man. So she frames this as being a formal doctrine incapable of proposing any content to the freedom which it wants engaged. And she says, well, is it really like that? No, because willing oneself to be free as an actual human being means that you're going to point out some concrete action. If willing yourself to be free as a student is where you are, well, then you're figuring out whether you're going to do your homework tonight or not, or what you're going to study, or how you're going to view your fellow classmates. Are they competitors? Are they other people to collaborate with? How do you take in, your relationship to those you view as your superiors, or maybe don't view as your superiors or teachers? If you're in a relationship with another person, that is concrete. You can get all the relationship or dating advice or marriage advice that you want from some book, but sooner or later, you've got to apply it to your particular situation, and you do so as a free being, and you could do so as an existentialist. As a matter of fact, if you are an existentialist, you will engage in the concrete, right? Your actual situation. So that's a good response. She also points out, too, it also involves willing others to be free. As we just saw earlier, you can't exist on your own. Your freedom isn't something that is all by itself. You're in a world of others who don't share your values, your projects, your points of view. And that is going to lead to, like she says, concrete and difficult problems arising in our relationships with other people, to which she's going to turn in the third part. But that's also an important response to this charge that, you just have a formal doctrine, you can't give any content. How you actually live with and function with others, that is content, not just something purely formal. So this formula of, willing oneself to be free and that there be being turns out to actually have some, it's rather abstract. It has some rather concrete implications for us in terms of what it actually translates into in terms of how we live our lives.